Okay, welcome everyone to this next edition of VMACS. Just a quick reminder of the ground rules. Everyone's audio and video is going to be muted at all times. Your video can never be unmuted. During the Q&A session at the end, we will give you the opportunity, if you raise your hand to ask a question, to unmute yourself to ask a question via audio. But other than that, we ask you to direct any questions during the first 60 minutes using the Q&A feature and to reserve the chat feature in case there's technical or other difficulties. So with that being said, our host today is Morten Robin. So Morten, take it away.
So welcome everybody. It's great to have this paper today about estimating macroeconomic models of financial crisis. Let's hope this is not going to happen very soon, but it might. So we have Alessandro Rebucci presenting, and the other three co-authors are ready to answer any questions. Handing over to you, Alessandro. Go. You have 60 minutes.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Morten, for the introduction and the rest of the VMACS team. This is joint work with Gianluca, Andrew, and Chris, who are with us to take questions. The global financial crisis reignited a strong interest in causes, consequences, and remedies for financial crisis. And it goes without saying that the topic is relevant today. At the beginning in the US, when COVID erupted, there was financial market disruption, prompting the Fed to intervene with unprecedented actions. In emerging markets, a very large sudden stop in capital flows of the type we will be talking about today actually preceded COVID infection and now is accompanying the economic sudden stop, as you've seen in many other papers in this series, due to the lockdowns. In this context, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models with occasionally binding friction have proven to be successful both from a positive and a normative perspective. Structural estimation of this class of model is important for inference purposes, for counterfactual analysis and forecasting, but in this highly nonlinear environment is difficult. The reason why it's difficult, you can see by eyeballing the data. So here are two series from our empirical exercise, quarterly output growth and the current account to output ratio. The black line is output growth. And you can see that nested in the regular fluctuations, there are these very large dislocations of varying persistence. So this is the debt crisis, which is not as deep as the tequila crisis, but is much more persistent. And over here, you see the global financial crisis. This model with occasionally binding frictions are particularly suited to try to describe the different type of dynamics in the same framework. So the main contribution of the paper is along three lines. First of all, we propose a new formulation of an occasionally binding friction, a collateral constraint, a borrowing constraint, reformulation as an endogenous regime switching process. Secondly, we develop a perturbation-based solution method, which is whose key feature is speed and scalability, and is relatively accurate. So that lead us to be able to use likelihood methods for estimation purposes. And then we apply to Mexico history of cycles and crises with quarterly data since 1981. The empirical results, the main results, consist of estimates of the key parameter of the financial frictions, which are novel. They've not been estimated in the literature before, with their confidence interval that provide benchmark for the typical calibrated values used in the literature. We show that the model does well at fitting both cycles and crises. And here, in a medium scale model, you will see we have 6 structural shocks. We find that different shocks matter for different variables at the business cycle frequency. And interestingly, when we look at crisis dynamics, not only different shocks explain different phases of the crisis, but also different shocks are important for different historical episodes. The paper relates to a pretty large literature, and here to summarize, we are closely related to obviously the estimation literature in the DSG model, pioneered by Frank Schorfheiden, then Smets and Wouters, and Chris, who is here with us. And also a few papers attempted to estimate or did accomplish estimation of this model with occasionally binding constraint. I have Luigi Boccola, JP paper in particular in mind, and what we are doing is providing a tool that can be applied potentially more flexible to a general class of model. There is a very well-developed literature on solving and estimating regime switching models, and obviously we have point of contact with many of those. These point of contacts are anchored to the specific needs of our application and our technical problem. And then there is a long-standing literature on emerging market business cycles, which has used both linearized models, notably one, and some of them estimated also, and models with occasionally binding constraint. And we, in the paper, we go a long way in trying to document how we do relative to that literature. So let me come to the model framework. We use a workhorse medium-scale dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model. There are two, to give a sense of the size, there are two endogenous state variables and 6 shocks. The model, the structural equation of the model come from Enrique Mendoza 2010 seminal contribution on the occasionally binding borrowing constraint applied to emerging markets. Then we broaden the set of shocks, including all those that were considered by Martin Uribe, Garcia Chico, and another couple of co-authors in evaluating the hypothesis, evaluating the relative importance of productivity shocks relative to interest rate shocks. What is the distinctive feature of our proposed formulation? So we have that the economy switches endogenously between two regimes. One in which the borrowing constraint is binding, we will call it binding regime or constraint regimes, and the constraint holds with equality. And then a non-binding regime in which borrowing by the household firm is completely unconstrained. And the economy switches between these two regimes stochastically rather than deterministically, as we will see momentarily, as a function of key endogenous variable of the model. In particular, leverage is the endogenous variable that governs the transition from non-binding to binding, and the multiplier associated with the borrowing constraint will be the signal that govern the switch back to the unconstrained regime. So these are the key structural equations. We have GHE preferences, and there is a shock to the discount rate. So this is a difference relative to the specification in Enrique's work. We have output that is produced with capital, labor, intermediate imported input, capital V, and therefore GDP is the difference between gross output and the value of the intermediate input. Second source of shock is the exogenous process for the price of these intermediate inputs. We have adjustment cost on investment, quadratic, very standard. And then, second important friction in the model is a working capital constraint, which has been a prevalent feature in models of business cycle in emerging markets. The idea is that firms has to prepay the wage bill and the bill for imported intermediate input, and they need to borrow against collateral for acquiring this working capital constraint. Here, another shock. This capital E is a shifter in the aggregate demand, in the expenditure of the economy, and is broadly interpreted as capturing shifting external demand for output produced domestically, or the behavior of fiscal policy. We don't have government explicitly in the model. These are the processes. So technology, term of trade or intermediate input, the preference shock, the expenditure shifter, and then the interest rate processes. Two aspects of the specification are important here. In principle, we could allow in this framework the parameter of the processes also to be regime switching. This would allow us much greater flexibility. We could accommodate structural break or dynamic features similar to stochastic volatility. We choose not to in order to allow the key friction we care about, the collateral constraint, to see how far it can go in describing the data. Other important aspect here is the specification of the interest rate process. So RT is the market interest rate, is the interest rate at which the small open economy can borrow international capital market. Is assumed to be the sum of three components. This R star is a persistent component meant to represent, if you will, world risk-free interest rate, and is calibrated to US short-term real interest rate. And the process is the standard AR1 over here. The second component is a temporary, is a IID process. So we took out persistence completely, and is meant to capture exogenous changes in the risk premium. Now we have this endogenous deterministic component over here, which in some models of emerging markets business cycles is interpreted as a financial friction. In particular, in the paper I referred to earlier by Martin and his co-authors, this parameter is estimated to what the data say should be, and is the source of endogenous propagation of interest rate shocks. In our case, the sole purpose of this component over here is to pin down the distribution net foreign asset of foreign debt when the economy is far away from the constraint. When we are close to the constraint or at the constraint, we would not need it, but we do need this device. For example, in Enrique's model, there is endogenous discounting that does it serves the same purpose. So here come the key part, and I'm going to slow down for a little bit. So agent face a regime-specific constraint, which is indexed by this lowercase s variable, one when the constraint is borrowing. And in the constraint regime, they face a borrowing constraint which holds with equality. So this is borrowing for working capital purposes. This is borrowing for consumption smoothing purposes, and is equal to a fraction k kappa of the collateral, where capital serves as collateral evaluated at current equity price, a current price, relative price of capital, with the associated multiplier lambda t. In the other regime, when the economy is not constrained, indexed by lowercase st equal to 0, borrowing is unrestricted, and for the purpose of our, for notational purposes, it's useful to define B star essentially as the difference of the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the first equation on top of the slides. And we'll call this the borrowing quotient, which measure the borrowing capacity at each point in time is how much borrowing capacity is left to the economy before hitting the constraint. So how does the economy switch between these two regimes? Is governed by the indicator ST, which is drawn from logistic distribution. When we go from the unconstrained to the constrained regime, so the probability of going from 0 to today to ST plus 1 equal 1 tomorrow is a logistic which depends on the borrowing quotient. The intuition is that the smaller the borrowing capacity, the closer I am to the borrowing limit, the higher the probability to draw a constrained regime switch that switches the economy into that state. Vice versa, once the economy is in the constrained regime, the probability of reverting back to normalcy is also a logistic function that depends on the multiplier on the constraint. So the closer the multiplier is to 0, the more likely it is to switch back. So here a few remarks on these specification. This is our first and most important contribution, something that is it's new relative to literature. So establishing whether or not this specification is a solution of an optimal contracting problem is beyond the scope of the paper. We are not arguing that this is it could be, but we are not certainly going in that direction, and it will not be feasible within this paper. Renegotiation, hiding liquidity, as we will see from some micro evidence, or random monitoring by the lender are all mechanisms through which something along this line could emerge as an equilibrium outcome, but that's not our purpose. However, it's important to stress that there is a lot of empirical evidence suggesting that a stochastic specification, so this the idea that there is that constraint don't always bind at the same level of leverage, is intuitive and consistent with the data. So let me give you briefly the macro and the micro evidence that are consistent with this idea. From the macro perspective, for example, there is work by Jorda and Alan, etc., showing that using the historical data for advanced economies, that while the likelihood of incurring a financial crisis increases with leverage, there is no single leverage level at which historically realized crises have happened. A similar notion is a notion of debt intolerance of Reiner and Rogo. If you remember a few years ago, there was a lot of discussion. There is a lot of empirical work on the threshold, and that threshold cannot be pinned down precisely in a mechanic manner. Again, the idea that there is uncertainty once you are in a vulnerable area. The credit surface of Foerster and Giannakopoulos, I think, embed a similar idea. More broadly, we know the lending standards are fluctuating over the cycle, and again, is something consistent with a specification like the one that we are proposing. At the micro level, actually, this is an interesting paper that is waiting to be written to document specifically whether or not and how borrower and lenders behave close to the borrowing constraint. There is a lot of sparse evidence that is consistent with the idea. For example, there is evidence that borrower and lenders engage in renegotiation of covenants as they approach credit limits, rather than having these covenant trigger and imposing financial constraint in a mechanic manner. We also know that financially constrained firms tend to draw down pre-existing line of credit once the market entered to distress phase. And there was a lot of these in the news in mid-March. There were a lot of headlines about this. More recently, there is new work just completed by Yuran Ma and Chen that shows that firms borrowing seems to be, at least in their sample, the largest share of the contract are constrained by cash flow variable as opposed to asset type of constraints or LTV type of constraint, suggesting that the typical asset price spirals and fire sale amplification, which are at the core of the models that we are working, may not be the only mechanism, and they call for more theoretical modeling of alternative specification. So, having said this in the way of justifying why we think is a good approximation of the data for positive purposes, let me move into the technical part. So the key challenge is to map the traditional slackness condition, which is represented here by the product of the multiplier and the borrowing cushion equal to 0 into something that remain continuously differentiable as the economies switch across regimes. So this complex equation here, which is a function of deviation from steady state of the multiplier over here, deviation from the steady state, which I will define in a couple of slides, deviation from steady state of the borrowing cushion and the steady state values, is the technical device. This is combined with the definition of switching parameter, regime switching parameter, this psi and nu as a function of the indicator. The notation here, there is a little bit of an abuse of notation because one need that for more general specification. In our application, this switching parameter will boil down to the indicator variable. But in general, the general principle, the partition principle in Andrew's work on which we are building is that we need to separate essentially the parameters that affect the steady state from the parameters that affect the dynamics of the economy and treat them differently. And combined with this variable defined over here, it has a nice implication that with the two values of the switching variable, we can replicate, or we in equilibrium, we have the slackness condition behaving as in the model with traditional model with inequality. So given the regime slackness condition, we combine it with, as usual, first order condition, resource constraints, market prices, and the processes. We need to compute a solution. We take a perturbation route for the reason mentioned earlier. We need speed and scalability. And the next technical challenge is the selection of an approximation point. There are a lot of options in the literature for different purposes. Here, because of the nature of the problem, we are good and we are doing well with a single point approximation. This will be, and it is, a weighted average of the two steady states, the two ergodic branches of the solution, weighted with ergodic probabilities of being in those states. The point is, or the problem is that these probabilities are endogenous for what I showed earlier. And so there is a fixed point problem where the steady state, the probability depend on the equilibrium and the equilibrium depend on the probabilities. So it's a fixed point problem that we solve numerically with the procedure that is in appendix of the paper. With our approximation point, we characterize the solution, and we are able to establish this important result, which helps appreciating what endogenous switching does in this environment. The proposition states that if we were to stop at the first order solution of the model that we set up, the decision rule would be identical to the first order solution of an exogenous regime switching. As you will see in a few slides down the road, evidence is that exogenous regime switching would not be a good characterization of the data as we describe them in estimation. So it means that in order to capture the role of an endogenous regime switching, and therefore the precautionary saving impact on those decision rule and the likes, we need to go at least second order, which is why we solve the model at this order of approximation. The solution we discussed in the paper is fast, certainly, is scalable. There is no obvious technical reason why it shouldn't. We work with two-state variable and 6 shocks. This is medium scale, is not central bank size type of model, but it's not a baby toy model. It applies to a general class of models, so several frictions. So for example, one could think about in this new COVID literature about capacity utilization of the healthcare system that is not always there. I mean, as the epidemic evolves, that constraint goes up and down. or consumption at some point during the crisis hitting a subsistence level. So applicability is more general, and it is accurate. We do some work on accuracy, and we document it in the paper. In terms of estimations, it's challenging because we have multiple regimes. We have to approximate at the second order, and we have endogenous transition, and it took us a lot of time. We've been around with this paper for quite some time, but we are not innovating. So we are borrowing tools from the nonlinear estimation literature, both dynamic stochastic and regime switching. In addition, so here is a key point. Immediately the particle filter jumps to mind. The reason why here particle filter is not used is a practical one. It would take forever to do something like that. Andrew can comment more specifically on the deeper computational reason why that is the case. The idea, to give you a sense, we have a Monte Carlo Markov chain with 500,000 draws, and it took us about, if I remember correctly, 4 or 5 months. If we were to try to do the same with the particle filter, we calculated that it would be more than a year. So that's a limitation, but there is also good technical reasons for using the sigma point filter that we use to evaluate the likelihood as opposed to the particle filter. As a strategy, we don't estimate everything. We focus on the parameters that are core for the issue, for the economic issue we are studying, and we calibrate what has been the parameters on which there is consensus in the literature. We also estimate the adjustment cost of investment because it's not easy to pin it down from moments of the data. So I already mentioned we use quarterly data from since 81 when these data are available, comparable to other studies in the literature. We have 6 observables for 6 shocks: the national account, output, consumption, and investment. The country interest rate, which is measured as standard in this literature following Uribe and Vivian Yu. It's the US real short-term rate plus the country premium, typically is a EMBI country premium. And then we have output, current account to GDP. We've done a version of this estimation with the trade balance. They behave very similarly. And then a measure of, we use a term of trade indicator without oil prices as a measure for the important intermediate input. We do add measurement errors, even though we don't need them to complete the state space because we have same number of observable as shocks, because we are aware of measurement errors in the data, in particular for investment. And also we do a backward estimate of the country premium. The EMBI stops in 1993. So it's prudent to do this, but we cap those at 5% of the variance of the observables. So here are some results. First results are the structural estimates. There are 2 parameters that are particularly important: working capital constraint over here and the leverage parameter. As you can see, they have a uniform prior on pretty wide ranges. The working capital constraint could go above 1, but there is only one study in the literature that does that. Most of them stay below 1. And it comes out pretty tightly estimated with a value that is on the high end of the range. So this 0.7 is clearly below, I think is Neumeier-Perry using 1 in their early paper in the 2000s on emerging market business cycles. Enrique used 0.25, 0.26, if I remember correctly. And this is very close to a new paper by Felipe Safi with microdata on Chilean corporate sector, which I think estimated close to 0.6. Leverage constraint, very tight. again, to give you a sense, in Enrique's paper, there are three scenarios, three possibilities: 15% or 0.15, 0.15, 0.2, and 0.3. We come down at the low end of that range. Now, most interesting from our perspective was the fact that the logistic parameter down here, we gave them a very flat and very diffuse prior. They come out precisely estimated and also different between them in a way. The number doesn't mean anything per se, but in a way that now here you can appreciate. So what this picture does, plots the logistic. The red dashed line is the estimated logistics, so the logistic substituting the posterior mode of the estimated parameter with the distribution, the ergodic distribution of the argument, which is the borrowing cushion in the upper panel and the multiplier in the lower panel. So the intuition is the one that I was describing earlier. As the borrowing cushion goes towards zero, the probability of drawing a constraint regime start to increase. So a constraint regime could be drawn before we pass the zero borrowing cushion or immediately after, right? But what you can see that as we go into negative territory, the probability approaches 1, and then we are certain to switch. Most of the time, the economy stays on the right-hand side of distribution, so it stays over here. Here is where we have most of the probability, but this is not just a 5 or 10% tail. So there is also significant probability to stay over here. What does it mean? It means that the economy is already highly levered, right? It's in a vulnerable situation, but because of the exogenous shocks, because of its history in terms of the endogenous states, it's not yet in the worst possible place, and the probability has not gone high enough to make it certain to switch. Here is the same logic. As the multiplier goes towards zero, it's more likely that we switch back. We can switch back to the unconstrained regime even with a positive multiplier if an ST plus 1 equals 0 is drawn here. But it could also be that we get stuck in the constrained regimes past the point that the multiplier has reached 0, and household would be in a position to borrow more than what the regimes allow. So this feature is what will characterize, what will drive our results on the different duration of crisis generated by the model and the persistence of both the build-up phase and the recovery that, as you will see, are quite persistent according to the estimated model. And what is interesting is the fact that those two different parameters give us they give us distribution that these two distributions are different in the sense that the amount of probability left immediately to the right or immediately to the left is significantly different because of the two estimated parameters in a way that is economically interpretable, because it's easier. What we see that these crises don't last in the data. They are not as persistent as the expansion or as the boom phase. So what the estimated parameters capture is the fact that it's easier to get out of the crisis than to come into the crisis. So this is model fit data and estimated for output only. We have similar picture in the paper, and a couple of observations. We don't lose fit in none of the crises. So you see these red bars are the peak of the crisis, are the trough in output. You can see clearly right here. And we don't lose fit during these episodes. And we do so without relying on large shocks. So the two bars over here are two standard deviations bands, and you can see that we are always inside. Small exception over here, little bit more of a large shock at the beginning of the sample. For the procedure here, it's very hard to deal with the beginning of the sample because essentially the economy hits a debt crisis 1.5 years after we start to observe the data. So overall, we do well in terms of fit with small shocks, which is very different than the typical exercise on the Great Depression or on the Greek crisis or on some emerging market crises where large shocks need to be fed to the model in order to see explain the dynamics of the data. Second moment, I have 25 minutes, right? Okay.
Yes, you do, yeah.
Yeah. So second moments of the data, we do well. There are a couple of important stylized facts that there's actually 3 that describe emerging market business cycles. The ABC of that is generating consumption volatility larger than output volatility. If anything, we have a little bit too much of that. A trade balance or a current account that is procyclical. We do quite well over here. And I'm not reporting in this table, but another important aspect is the fact that the trade balance should have persistence that is well below 1. Actually, Uribe and Garcia Chico paper and Pancrazzi is pretty much centered on that particular moment, and they show that the standard RBC model without financial friction by construction, if you will, cannot do that. So having a trade balance, and we are doing just fine with that without imposing a high elasticity of that deterministic component in the interest rate. Where we do not do too well is in volatility of the country market interest rate. It's not clear whether this is a problem or not. I'm talking about this correlation at minus 0.03. Reason being that toward the end of the sample, Mexico start to be more like a small open economy, that more like Canada, say, than Brazil or Argentina. Well, the beginning of the history was not distinguishable. So for the data, one would have to introduce something there to probably do better, and we are looking into that. This is the variance decomposition. I have to warn you that it's a nonlinear variance decomposition. So it gives a sense of the relative importance of shocks for the business cycle, but is not exactly the same statistics that you would obtain, say, out of Dynar or a linearized estimated framework. The key message is that different shocks, I highlighted, just as a few examples, I highlighted in bold, matter for different variables. What is interesting is that, which is not easy to generate in this class of model, the TFP, the technology shock, does not do the bulk of the job across variables. Interest rate shocks are important, in particular for investment, for the trade balance, for the borrowing cushion. Not surprisingly, the flow and the stock here are closely related, and also for the multiplier, obviously. These variance shares are lower than what Garcia Chico, Pancrazzi, etc. estimate. But our TFP share is lower because in their work, expenditure and preference shocks play much less of a role. For disclosure here, there may be a concern that the expenditure shock and the preference shock may be picking up some where the model lacks in its ability to explain everything with the mechanism. But I think overall the message is that different shocks explain different variables in a way that seems to be meaningful and interpretable. So here we're going to look into crises. We are toward the last set of results. This picture is probably one of the most interesting in the paper. What I'm plotting is the the smoothed probability of being in a binding regime. There is a subtle distinction here. The agents, the household firms, always know whether they are in the constrained or unconstrained regime. However, the procedure, the econometrician and the procedure has to make inference about the state of the economy. So it's a probabilistic statement because it's filtered through the data. So this probability is smoothed in the sense that it uses all the sample information backward and forward at any point in time. And the black solid line plots this probability. So with this, we define a crisis quarter as a crisis in which its probability is very high. And there is an element of, there is a degree of freedom in establishing how high should be a probability. Fortunately, it's bounded to 1. So we selected 90%, but we have a lot of margin. It could be higher, it could be lower. The inference that we make would be pretty much the same. So these dash lines over here, and an episode, a crisis episode, are consecutive periods in which economy meet this criterion. So probability of being in the binding regime from a perspective of the econometric procedure higher than 90%. So episodes are consecutive period. Then we plot these red bars, which are crisis episode using the same type of criteria adopted previously in the literature, which is something related to the borrowing constraint, so typically multiplier positive or the borrowing constraint binding. In addition, in order to discard episode of associated episode of binding collateral constraint associated with small output drops or small current account reversal, the constraint that the output drop and the current account reversal is larger than a certain size is added. So if we do that, we identify these red bars, which I had used also earlier. And the first thing that you see that our model-based, purely model-based definition of crisis is much more persistent than what in our own work. For example, we have used, when we do quantitative work in our normative papers, we have used the red bar notion of crisis. The shaded gray areas represent the Reiner and Rogoff crisis tally index, which is essentially an index based on narrative that classify each year of Mexico history as being yes or no crisis year along 6 type of crisis. There is internal, external debt default, there is inflation crisis, there is exchange rate crisis, stock market crisis, and I think that's about it. We normalize the index, so the index go from 0 to the absolute level of the index go from 0 to 6, whether in 1 year you have all type of crisis, and then we normalize to 1. So you can see that according to the index, Mexico was facing the worst possible economic scenario for a little bit less than a couple of years in the 80s, but then stayed in a persistent state of distress for many years because obviously this is the debt restructuring and the banking crisis. In the mid-1990s, the tequila crisis is very well known in terms of external capital flows for being V-shaped. So there was a lot of the external dimensional crisis resolved quickly, but then there was a very protracted banking crisis. While during the global financial crisis, Mexico had only very large depreciation, stock market crash, but none of these more damaging episodes. So obviously we don't have default in the model, we don't have banking crisis, but clearly we do pretty well, number one, at generating crises of different duration. And we do also relatively well, at least for 2 out of these 3 episodes, in matching what is a pretty conservative assessment of the narrative crisis history of Mexico. So we are very excited about this picture. Interestingly, when we ask whether our crisis signal can mistake ordinary recession, so what is classified as an ordinary business cycle downturn, according here to the OECD classification. These are lighter gray shaded areas or bars. You can see that sometimes they overlap, but when those recession comes without any other problem, here in the mid 80s and in the early 90s, or this is around the time of the dot-com crash in the US, or again, the recession after the global financial crisis, our crisis indicator may move, but it doesn't go and signal, it doesn't flash red. So the procedure, the econometric model, estimated model, does not mistake ordinary recession for episode of financial crisis, in particular sudden stop in capital flows. So this is attempting to be the equivalent of the variance decomposition for the crisis episodes. Is even more complicated to do this counterfactual. We do it by shutting down one shock at a time and evaluate and asking ourselves, what does the likelihood look like relative to the likelihood when all shocks are left operating and working. And we do it distinguishing not only by episodes, so the debt crisis, the tequila, and the global financial crisis, so essentially those periods over here where the dash vertical lines where the criterion is met. So these dates correspond to those periods. But we also look at before the crisis, so what is driving the build-up during the crisis for the duration identified by the model, and after the crisis. As I mentioned, we have a little bit of a constraint at the beginning of the sample period, and we can look only 2 quarters prior for the debt crisis, but we look 2 years prior and 2 years after for the tequila and the global financial crisis. Different colors here give you, if you had the time to go into the details, would tell you that different shocks matter for different episodes. So for example, the debt crisis driven by a collapse on the supply side, so TFP is quite important, and also an important role of here above 1, the indicator is normalized such that these numbers are relative to 1. Now I'm not remembering correctly one thing, but a positive number means relatively more important. So the larger it is, the more important is relative to the likelihood with all shocks activated. So interest rate, both components before the crisis, so pushing the economy into the crisis. During the crisis, huge TFP losses, probably due to the banking crisis and the debt crisis here, not in the model, but captured by the TFP shocks. Tequila, quite different. We see that and this may be a bit suspicious, we need to work more on this. It attributes the bulk of the importance to the term of trade shock. And what is interesting is that not only across variables, but you also see the difference importance of the shock as the phase of the crisis changes. So interest rate shocks during the tequila crisis are not the most important, -0.1, relative to likelihood with all shocks, but then they become important during the crisis. These are the 2 years of the 8 quarters of the crisis. The interest rate shocks is very important, and then after the crisis, it goes back down. So similar message, different shocks important for different variables, not only for different historical episodes, but also different phases within the cycle. Very flexible, very rich, obviously hard to pin down a clear, distinctive message, but some of these especially in the case of the debt crisis, clear and interpretable, some more work to do on our part on this tequila crisis business. So let me move into simulating out of the estimated model. Here we ask the simulated model to generate crises of different frequency. We condition on crisis of at least 4 quarters because this is a shorter one in the estimated episode. So this is the relative frequency in 10,000 simulations of crisis episode of more than 4 quarters. The mean and the median is around 5, so a little bit more than a year. And what is important here is the very large heterogeneity. So we can, the economy can get stuck because of the feature of the stochastic specification of the switch. It can, of the endogenous switching, can get stuck in the constraint regime up to 20 quarters. Obviously, this is an event, an episode that has this type of episode have very low probability of occurring, but episode of 8 quarters, they are not, they don't have completely negligible probability of occurrence. And you saw that in the data, we identified 2 of those out of the past 40 years of data. So with this in mind, so here we simulate a condition on the shortest that we saw in the data. We have asked ourselves, what does the crisis dynamics look like in those nasty episodes that have lasted at least 8 quarters? We have a 9-quarter one, which is the tequila crisis, according to our model, and the 8-quarter one during the debt crisis. So here we impose a constraint that the crisis episode has to last at least 8 quarters. So in terms of probability, we are here. We are capturing pretty rare events. So what these, I have 2 slides, one on the driving forces and one on the outcomes, the behavior of the economy. What this picture over here shows is that the key message is that it's not so much any particular large shock that pushed the economy into one of these very bad episodes, but is more of a cocktail of shocks. So what we see that the build-up, the boom phase, as you will see in a minute, is driven by a very strong expansion in technology and productivity, improving term of trade, improving external condition, pretty stable preferences, a fall in the external cost of borrowing, that the persistent component is coming down persistently, and expenditure too, it tends to actually go down a little bit, as opposed to, so it doesn't appear to be an important driver. In this representation, it's difficult to see what the temporary component of the interest rate does, but I'll come to that in a minute if I have time. So then, as we approach, what you can see here is a reversal in the TFP. You see that the TFP is reverting over here. We have a drop in patient. This is before we enter into the constraint regimes, and you have this inversion in the term of trade, so it becomes more expensive to import intermediate input, and you also have an inversion in the interest rate. And then these adverse circumstances, this cocktail, actually persist. So technologies stay there at the depressed level for quite some time. Patience reverts all of a sudden and does so persistently. Cost of borrowing increased very persistently, and the cost of intermediate inputs. And at this point, we see this sharp increase in the expenditure shock, which is where probably we have a little bit of lack of identification, in the sense that it could represent the net exports, picking up the role of net export through depreciation in driving aggregate demand, or an attempt to cushion with fiscal expansion. But in Mexican data, if anything, this should be preceding the crisis, not during the crisis. So question mark on this result over here. So gradually build up, then a sudden acceleration, and then an inversion and a persistent deterioration during the crisis. And you see what's happened with output. Output gradually build up over time. We start 5 years before the crisis, and we go 10 years after the episode. Oh, sorry. After the episode, we have this gradual build up. We have the sudden acceleration, then the drop before getting in the constraint regime, and then a persistent drop during the period of constrained borrowing. From peak to trough here, we have a drop of 8% of GDP. The trade balance, which is, if you will, the net is the primary external balance, is net capital flows. Does something similar. There is a sudden deterioration before the crisis, then that's a capital flow reversal, and then it stays persistently elevated, and then it slows down a little bit. But what you can see here that it doesn't go exactly back at the same level. So this is a primary surplus that post-crisis stay higher than before crisis. Similar dynamics, this external financing premium on that is the country premium in the notation of the structural model that we are using. What is worrisome here is this output. There is actually no recovery here. I mean, 10 years out in this simulation, you don't see a recovery yet. On the contrary, you keep seeing output going down and going down past where it started 5 years before the crisis. We wrote a VOX column focusing on that. Even if we don't take it literally, the message is coming out here that once you allow the data to speak, the data tells you that the sudden stop can be very persistent. And if I may go back to our picture over here, we are picking up this episode here with the black solid lines, but the narrative approach to describing tells us that yes, the access to external finance may be restored relatively quickly. Even during the 1980s, Mexico was able to go back and borrow with the support of official financing. But then that crisis and banking crisis, they can have very protracted, long-lasting effect. While these are not in our model, are in our data, and we have a model that allows, through this flexible specification of the financial friction, to pick it up. And this is what a crisis through the lens of our model simulation look like. Pretty scary, especially if we now were to put it in context as we did with our VOX column. So let me conclude. I think I'm almost right on time for once. We do propose a new approach to specify and solving model with occasionally binding friction more generally, specifically an occasionally binding borrowing constraint. We use this framework to study Mexico history of cycle and crisis. We find that the model fits the data and the crisis episode relatively well. We identify crisis episode of variable duration and intensity driven by different shocks at different times. And a bullet that is not on my slides, it doesn't bode well for what we have witnessed over the past couple of months in the US and in the rest of the world economy. I'm very concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alessandro. So let me just remind the audience, if you want to ask a question, you raise your hand. So you go to the participant list and you just click on your name. I will shoot off with a question, but after that, let's have questions from the floor, please. So one thing I was wondering about is this logistic process you have for the multipliers and so on. And I'm wondering whether actually I'm wondering about the extent to which that sort of is emulating some stochastic sunspots there, because you have probabilities of the constraint sort of at the intermediate level. So it could happen, or it could not happen, or it may happen, or it may not. Yeah. So is that not so? To that extent, actually, I mean, yeah. If I was to think about the uniqueness of equilibrium in your model, it's a sort of a little bit fuzzy, isn't it?
Andrew, Gianluca, do you want to pick it up? Or shall I go?
So I think I can answer that. I mean, so we don't really think of it as sunspots. I mean, we can't prove uniqueness of equilibrium here. There are circumstances with these regime switching models where you can, but we actually can't here. What we're interpreting the constraint as is that there's various external things that happen, shocks that happen, that mean that people impose the constraint at different levels of leverage. It's not always the same level of leverage where the constraint gets imposed. And so there's a stochastic nature to it, but it still maintains this idea that the higher your leverage ratio is, the more likely you are to get into the crisis. And then I'll let Andrew or Gianluca add to that.
Yeah, I don't have anything substantial to add to that.
I'm just thinking about how the estimation works in that case, because so it seems like in that intermediate part where this logistic function is sort of sloping that yeah, so there may associate the I'm just thinking about how in that regime how are the observables related to sort of the model in that.
Right. So the you know, the model implies that when the constraint binds, that there's this very specific way that borrowing and hence consumption and all these other observables are going to behave, right? And yeah. So when you're in this intermediate range, the filtering process is taking into account the behavior of these observables and then says, okay, I think that whatever with some % probability you're in the binding regime versus not. So when you're in this intermediate range, yes, there's sort of, there's going to be some determination in the filtering algorithm which regime you're in.
But so are the parameters then uniquely identified then?
Yeah, so I think we have these.
Okay.
Sorry. Right.
No,
so if you look at our our posterior age coverage intervals, they're pretty precisely estimated. I will say that one thing that we get from this second order solution, and Alessandro mentioned this, is that rational expectations kind of kick in, right? And so there's this case where even when you're away from the constraint, the fact that agents in the model know that there's this the constraint may bind in the future affects their decisions even when they're not borrowing constrained, right? And so that helps inference a little bit about the slope of the logistic function and behavior in the crises and things like that.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. I think
good question though.
I think Ralf Lütke has another question.
Yeah, just a quick one, or actually like two quick ones. So the first one, because we're just discussing it, that agents take into account that there's uncertainty about the regime that you're in, and this affects their policies. But you just do a second order approximation, right? So just there's an intercept in the policy function, and typically like in the Fernandez-Villaverde AR paper, you have like a third order, higher order perturbation solution to be able to fully capture the just the uncertainty part of the regimes. And that was one question. And then the other question is just about whether you ran any kind of policy counterfactuals. So let's suppose you have a very different, monetary rule or fiscal rule. How does the likelihood of ending up in the bad regime, how does it change?
Yeah, both of those are good questions. So we have this, theorem in the paper that says that you need to go to at least second order in order to capture the effects of endogenous endogenous probabilities, right? So we know, we know from the get-go that a first order approximation isn't gonna cut it. Now, whether third order, starts to capture additional stuff, well, we don't have stochastic volatility in the way that, Jesus and others have it. And so, we could add that, and in which case I think we would need to start to go to third order. But, for our current context, second order is sort of sufficient in order to capture the features that we're interested in. So we just want to stick with that. But certainly, going to third order can maybe help approximation accuracy, can start to capture some of these other things that you might be interested in adding to the model.
So that's because I was thinking that, this having this endogenous regime switching and probabilities is almost a bit like stochastic volatility, because sometimes you have like a 0 chance of going there. Sometimes it's kind of 50-50, and then sometimes 100%. So you have different kind of variances of these two regimes.
Yeah, so I mean, it would be too hard for us to, estimate a model with third order approximation. It is possible. I think very early on in this project, we did one solution to the third order. And given the methodology that Andrew developed earlier, we could. And so I think it's probably worth checking how much the decision rule change, using the posterior median or mode parameters and solving the model once, and see if the decision rules actually change. So we can look at that. To your second question about policy rules, we're very interested in that. We're actually working on a second paper now where we actually try to work through some rules. We just feel this paper is already way too long to do that in the context of the current paper. So we have a second paper we're working on where we're going to look at these sort of policy rule issues and how that keeps you away from the constraint, those types of things.
So let me just also, so there's a question in the Q&A about precautionary behavior. So one of the key features of this regime switching framework is that you do start to pick up this precautionary behavior. As I was saying, agents in the model internalize the fact that when they're away from the constraint, that they know that the constraint still exists and may bind at some point in the future, and this kicks in with precautionary behavior. And so the fact that our framework can handle this and the estimation can handle this is a key advance, and is not something that's necessarily captured by, say, piecewise linear models or things like that.
Yeah, I would say that this is the main purpose of going the way that we went, to be able to isolate those components. Otherwise, one could try more mechanically to replicate the dynamics.
And then and then the follow up on the second question. This is like exactly why policy counterfactuals I think are interesting in this environment, because you can start thinking about like macroprudential policy is something that we can handle pretty easily, because it affects decisions and hence the probability of realizing a crisis.
The audience is still being very shy, but I actually have another question, and I was thinking, I guess we're all extremely worried about this. That this crisis spreads a lot to the emerging markets. So I was I was wondering about whether what would happen in your model if you simulate the path of commodity prices. But you don't really have that in your model, I guess. But it seems like it would be something that should matter first order here. So at the beginning of
what you have in mind when you think about commodity prices, oil shock or?
Yeah, I mean basically the commodities exported by many emerging markets. So yeah, all kind of commodities. So commodity price have been very weak, no?
Yes.
No, here so you would kind of think that we are in the in a scenario where a crisis could occur for sort of self-fulfilling reasons. But it would be very interesting to see a simulation from your model and see like what does your model say about basic probability of a crisis coming. Because so far it was sort of at the beginning of the crisis it looked like things were going to go bad, and then the emerging market spread is sort of stabilized. I guess and the capital flows stabilize. But is the risk? It would seem like just looking at what's going on, the risk is still there. But
so it would be captured by the expenditure shock. So one could essentially model it as an exogenous shift in external demand, because those prices they're typically price takers in those markets. So that is doable, and then see what kind of dynamic implication it has. Because the term of trade variable that is actually an import price, so would not is meant to capture the way it enters the model is through a very different channel. But that exercise could be done.
I think it would be very interesting to use your model to look at what, should we worry about this, or is your model basically saying, no, don't worry about another crisis right now? I don't know if you tried it. It would be very tempting.
We have focused on these. I mean, at least my sense is that in terms of financing, we are not yet out of the woods. So the Fed did a miracle in stabilizing the center of the financial system.
Well, why not use your model to try and do it?
Sure, we are thinking about that. We're definitely thinking about that.
Okay.
But the financial constraint seems to be remaining very, very important. And then also the full consequences of the domestic lockdown, because the fiscal space and the ability to borrow domestically internally is not the same. Few emerging markets have ventured in doing quantitative easing. Obviously, the one that felt most confident on not to create more trouble than trying to solve, and they were successful. But it's unclear if the shock is persistent, how they're going to be dealing, because there is not much financing available and not many other solutions. So I personally remain very worried on the financial side. The term of trade shock is an additional channel through which they are vulnerable.
Okay, I think Laura has a question.
Hello. Okay, so I'm not super familiar with these models, so excuse me if my question doesn't make much sense. But from what I understand, the probability of switching regimes, the way you model it as a reduced form is just you make it a function of this B level, which is one of the state variables. But then in all this, the kind of the mechanisms that you mentioned, like the reduced form, empirical evidence, either macro or micro, those could be, you could think of those in another way of like, there's some other exogenous thing which makes B go very low, which is, like maybe one of the other shocks in your model. And then that's what gets you to switch. So I'm just curious about like I guess you could have done it differently where you make it a function of something else, which itself makes B go low in your model. Does that make sense?
So it's not really a reduced form thing that we're doing here. This is the exact borrowing constraint that we see in the literature on occasionally binding constraints. So it's not reduced form or it's a structural thing.
Sorry, I meant the probability of going into the binding constraint, right? Like you had these stories about what gets you there. And then you say, well, there is evidence that when this B thing is low, that it's more likely, and it's for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Let me clarify what I was trying to say. I was not trying to say that the evidence justified putting B in the logistic function. Mm-hmm. B is in the logistic function because it makes intuitive sense, is the key state variable in the model, right? Mm-hmm. And the borrowing multiplier, but we have no proof that this is sufficient statistics for whatever is the underlying true set of causes that would push an economy into the borrowing constraint. The micro evidence is consistent with the fact that there is no single value of B at which you switch from constraint to unconstrained. That's what the macro evidence is saying. The macro evidence is saying that as you approach your borrowing limit, right, you can pull out liquidity that you were hiding from your lender,
Mhm.
Your lender may not be on duty monitoring you and may allow you to get away a little bit, or you may be able to renegotiate the covenant and therefore pass the previously agreed limit. So that's what the micro evidence is saying. What the macro evidence is saying is that confirming the idea that there is no single level of B over K at which empirically in the macro data the crises have historically realized. There is really a range of value. If you remember Ken and Carmen discussion about that intolerance, right? They were talking about 40% for emerging market, 90% for advanced economy, if I remember correctly. But there is a lot of uncertainty around that value. So you see a lot of emerging markets that are above 40 and they are doing fine. In Argentina, that at 30 may get in trouble. So that's where what we are capturing with the specification. And like Chris was saying, the specification is structural as far as the two branches is just a connection between the two branches through logistic function, which, by the way, I didn't mention it, but there are a number, including Luigi's paper, where he estimated the model with the occasionally bounding constraint, in which for part of the model, you use the logistic function. There are model on financial crisis, Rancière and Kumhof. So it's we're kind of being conservative, but it's there is good justification for proceeding in this manner.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm still, the audience is still being extremely shy, but while we wait for somebody to have the courage, let me ask Ralph, because Ralph is another one.
Yeah, so just one more quick question or more suggestion. So I really like the charts in the end where you showed how do crises typically build up, what happens with the shocks like to TFP and to other stuff. So is there also some way to compare that to more reduced form evidence? For example, if you look at TFP in Mexico around this crisis event, does the TFP series look like this? And perhaps some of the other shocks, perhaps there's some reduced form evidence to compare?
Right. That's a good question. I don't have the answer on Mexico. That's something that we could do. Certainly, that evidence is consistent with panel on a large set of countries. So, for example, the paper on banking crisis by Frank Smets and Boissier, and there is a third co-author, I don't remember the name. They show dynamics in the data very similar with event studies. So it's a kind of a stylized fact that build up to persistent crises have a prolonged period of slow expansions that then all of a sudden come to a crash. It's a good point on checking it specifically against time series data for Mexico.
I actually have another one as well, which is so some of these episodes are pretty dramatic. They're like output and capital flows, they move a lot and so on. How well does the second order approximation work in this case, where you got such real big things going on?
In terms of accuracy?
Yeah.
I can answer, but I maybe Andrew, you want to?
Yeah, so the second order picks up you know, some of that. So it's definitely improving accuracy. I don't think we have an exact number for this case, but you know, the increased curvature that you're getting is definitely buying you some of these helping during these nonlinear times, highly nonlinear times.
On a smaller scale model, not exactly this one, we compare for the same specification, we compare global solution method on the endogenous switching and the perturbation method. We get essentially the same Euler equation errors. So along that particular criterion is good. Second moment is also relatively good. Now, the trick here is that the second moment of the data and their ergodic distribution, they are not too different from a model of the regular business cycle. So it's not a good yardstick to evaluate accuracy, but the Euler equation is more reliable.
I see that, yeah. But still, yeah, what? I mean, I'm just thinking, yeah, I mean, they are really like, I mean, some of these episodes are really quite dramatic, yeah. But yeah, I mean, well, I can see. I mean, there's a big advantage what you're doing computationally. So it's probably worth paying.
So I would just add, like during these crises, it's the bigger thing is the nonlinearity that's being captured by the regime switch rather than
Right.
you know, kind of the within regime second order solution or whatever. But
yeah. Okay. Don't know if the audience is being very shy. So I think probably what we'll do at this point is to say thanks a lot for the presentation.
Thank you all for hosting us. I appreciate it, and for running the whole series. Has been a lot of work for you guys, I imagine, but a big service to the profession.
Yeah, and then actually I want to add that on Thursday, we're probably going to make an announcement about a couple of things. So tune in. We'll also put it on the webpage and Twitter and so on. So new stuff is coming up. So looking forward to seeing you all on Thursday, where we have another talk, and that's going to be given by one of the panel members this time, Stefania Albanese. So see you all again on Thursday. And thanks a lot for listening in, and thanks a lot for giving the talk.
Thank you to you. Bye-bye.
Bye.